sport builds so much community, and I think that's absolutely a vital point with mental resilience as well.
For elite sport, we're supposed to be pushing hard, we're supposed to be outside our comfort zones, but where does being outside your comfort zone stray into becoming dangerous?
So it's very much about building your equipment, understanding how it works and what works for you. Obviously, everybody has an opinion on what's the best piece of kit, but go with your own experience and those that you regularly travel with and see what works for them and understand what works for you.
Everyone, and welcome to Being Crisis Prepared, Inverroy Crisis Management's podcast about all things resilience. We're going to continue our unofficial mini-series about how some of the resilience techniques required by sport and physical activity can be used in your personal and professional lives. I am Sarah Batts, a crisis and continuity consultant, and I'm delighted to introduce my colleagues who will be joining me on today's podcast, David Payne and Stuart Armstrong. In this episode, we are diving into water-based activities, talking about resilience in sport more in depth, and just building on the previous episode that we did of resilience in sport, but that was more focused on running. So please feel free to go back and listen to that if this is of interest. David, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, hello, and thanks so much for inviting me onto this. It's great to be on to another Inverroy podcast. David Payne, as you introduced me at, and senior consultant with Inverroy. And for my sins, I'm also a volunteer swimming coach. So my interest in this from a resilience perspective is that resilience in sport, especially amongst people anything up from 8 to 20 years old at varying levels of competition. But I'm also very interested in it from a rehabilitation perspective. A number of our swimmers have injuries. So that mental resilience that is required to get back in the water again and carry on striving to achieve and perform at their best. So look forward to the discussions. Stuart, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, Stuart Armstrong, also crisis continuity management consultant. My interests away from Inverroy are largely water-based. So I've been kayaking for almost as long as I can remember. And then more recently, coastal rowing and sailing. And so fair breadth of experience in those areas, both competitively and purely for social and leisure purposes. So looking forward to discussing some of the other aspects of resilience and potentially things like equipment and how the environment can affect you.
And that's actually a really good point, talking about equipment resilience. I know you've got a lot of experience in sea kayaking. And if you're off the coast of somewhere really isolated, equipment failure can be critical. So how do you ensure that your gear is reliable? Like, what maintenance are you doing beforehand? Like, what backup strategies do you have in place when something goes wrong? And do you think that includes a lot of mental resilience?
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. I think you're absolutely right. You do rely heavily on equipment. Now, one of the great things about sea kayaking is that because the kayak carries a lot of the weight, you can maybe take a little bit more equipment than you would if you were running or hiking. But that doesn't necessarily mean you need to take the kitchen sink. So it's very much about building your equipment, understanding how it works and what works for you. Obviously, in today's world of social media, everybody has an opinion on what's the best piece of kit and what people might want to consider having. But go with your own experience and those that you regularly paddle with or travel with, and see what works for them and understand what works for you. And so the next follow on from that is very much looking after it. Some equipment can be quite expensive, and therefore, you want to get value for money from it. And so, taking care, particularly after your trips, to, clean it, make sure that it's stored properly. Many people just throw it in the garage where, this time of year in the UK, it tends to be pretty damp and cold. And sadly, that tends to sort of encourage mold and things and damage your equipment. So, yeah, keeping it nice and warm and dry, looking after it. And, that's all part of the fun of planning for the next trip and making sure that everything's ready to go and ready to support your trip in a resilient fashion.
Can I just jump in there as well? I was thinking about the same question from a swimming perspective. And initially I thought, no, there isn't really much. But on reflection, there's a surprising amount that could go wrong with swimming. And most people think, oh, I'm just going to put on my bathing suit or a pair of trunks and that's about it. So as long as I've got that, I'm fine. But the number of times I've seen swimmers coming out the changing rooms in floods of tears, especially female swimmers, wearing the very tight race suits that are hundreds and hundreds of pounds for a race suit, because in their haste to get it on, they have put their heel straight through it. So they are then trying to either borrow a suit or they're going back to get their second suit. But equally, up on the starting blocks, when you see swimmers there who've tried to put their hat on and it's just torn, they've tried to put their goggles on, they're nervous, they're not quite treating things as normal, and the goggles snap. And then regularly you see the more junior swimmers, the less experienced, let's say, who don't have that resilience. They haven't thought about it before. They haven't taken a little string bag up with them or a little mesh bag up with a spare pair of goggles, a spare cap in. The more senior ones take it all in their stride and they just say, whatever, I'll just reach around, I'll get my spare goggles and I'll pull those on. In my swimming bag, I now have 3 or 4 spare goggle bands for coaching, and I've become rather adept at restringing goggles very quickly. But again, it's all about prior planning and preparation, exactly as Stuart says.
It's interesting you say that, David, because I imagine, as you alluded to, it being hundreds of pounds to have a suit. Is it quite a costly sport to be resilient in? Is expected to have 2-3 spare goggles and hats? Is that something that would be essential to preparation, or would you say that, if you had one spare, you could fix it? As you said, you've been quite good at learning how to fix the equipment. Is that something you would advise as well?
Goggles and hats, definitely. So you would always want to have some spares of those. Generally, that team mentality, though, is if you would maybe able to borrow some from somebody else, but you don't want to borrow somebody's primary goggles and snap them right before their race. So you try and help each other out. But then your race suits and things are only up as you start climbing up the performance levels. They've actually brought in rules and regulations now to stop parents having to spend hundreds and hundreds of pounds on race suits for a 12-year-old, where actually the performance benefits of having the extra skin-tight suits are so negligible at that level. It's just unnecessary expense, but people feel that they should. So it was keeping up with the Joneses, but hats and goggles, definitely. Race suits only at the higher levels.
For me, brings it straight back to, our day jobs of helping organizations with their own resilience and, having a good track of, regular pieces of equipment that might fail, or, knowing where you can get a spare from through your supply chain at short order and things would be, a really useful thing for organizations to track, particularly when they start to bring in new equipment or new processes to identify where those failure areas are and they can prepare for them.
I think that's a really good point. And the swimmers they've automatically sort of got themselves into I know that I'm about the same size as so-and-so, so that if there is a problem, if I need to, I can go and try and source a separate costume or a suit, a race suit from somebody else. They've automatically started thinking about where their alternative supply line is. But yeah, for companies, that's definitely what they should be doing.
I think it's adapting to the conditions. And it's interesting that we talk about adaptation of conditions. And one thing that's particularly interesting is weather and the adversity of it. And how do you plan, prepare, and react to the changing of the weather, especially in water-based activities such as, an open water swim, if you're doing a triathlon, or rowing, sea kayaking, and sailing. I know there's been quite a lot in the news recently about Ironman open water swims, and we've had discussions about risk tolerance and individuals being quite risk averse. I'm wondering whether competitions or, the elites, is there now a new form or a new take on risk tolerance? Are people accepting more in elite sports?
I think there's a number of different facets to that question and potential answers to it. I think the one is that for elite sport, we're supposed to be pushing hard. We're supposed to be outside our comfort zones. But where does being outside your comfort zone stray into becoming dangerous? And some people will get a buzz from things being dangerous, things like mountaineering, etc., ice climbing, free climbing even, which I think is just nuts. But because you have no safety net, you don't have a rope, for it. There is a balance for the organisers of, we want to try to keep this event going, to keep people pushed outside their comfort zone, but equally, we want to be able to also make the most of any prior planning that they've done, to be able to say the cost of generating an event, the cost of cancelling an event can be so high. And we used to call it in the military, we used to call it press-on-itis. And I don't know if that is still I'm sure that is a phenomena and something that is faced by these organisers all the time. The last one I'll just throw in there then is that just being ready for the unexpected, being ready for that change, training, prior planning, and familiarity with what might go wrong. So consider how the conditions might worsen and what might you do if they do worsen. So you've got a plan up your sleeve for, if this happens, then this is what I'll do. If you have no plan and you have no fallback option, probably should be considering whether you do it in the first place. That would be my thoughts on it anyway. Stuart, I know you probably got more examples of this from a kayaking perspective.
Just thinking there, we're very blessed these days with the quality of weather forecasting, for example, where I saw a statistic the other day that says we can almost as accurately forecast 5 days ahead now as we could 5 hours ahead a couple of decades ago. But I think the risk there is that you rely on data and the information and interpreting that information and without looking out the window, which will always be the most accurate forecast. So, whether that's if you're sea kayaking, paying very good attention to how the situation is changing around you, and doing that, what we would call a dynamic risk assessment. So constantly evaluating how things have changed. Is it what you've expected? As the winds got up faster than you expected, for example, and then being ready to move to that plan B, which is part of your planning and would have been part of your discussion before you got in the water, but really observing the elements.
And it's interesting, you mentioned, Sarah, the Ironman. I think that certainly the one that caught my eye was the one in Ireland, where they had the Ironman over there. And unfortunately, there were 2 people that died in the event when they pushed on with it. They'd already cancelled one of it on the Saturday, so they rolled it forward from the Saturday into the Sunday, and then they had multiple people in the water. But the thing that struck me on there was that they decided to continue with it, but that for whatever reasons, I wasn't there, so I didn't see the conditions, and it's very difficult when you're looking at it in hindsight. But what did strike me was the fact that they obviously had kayaks in the water to help as a safety mechanism for the swimmers if they got into danger. But I noticed that there were a few people who commented that the kayaks that were out there, because of the waves, were struggling to get to the swimmers, which means that even though they'd put a plan in place for dealing with swimmers in trouble, that now couldn't actually be enacted as easily as they want to, which probably increased the risk a lot. So from a company perspective, yes, put a plan in place, but if that plan can't work, you might need to reconsider.
I think it's interesting who really gives the final say. Do the governing bodies have the final say, or is it the organisers? And, in these circumstances, is it because calling off such an event as an Ironman would be awful for, the costs? So they choose to increase their risk tolerance, say, it's at your own detriment, which when you have individuals in sport, especially doing an Ironman, you already see people that have got a higher personal resilience. Do we think that, the governing bodies and, the organisers should have more of a succinct view and actually do a risk analysis and come to the same conclusion of, it's actually too dangerous, we're not going to let the athletes make the decision? What is actually the best way forward for this?
It's a difficult challenge for both organisers and potentially governing bodies, largely because who would want to put their signature on the line, if you like. And I think often with these things, individuals at the end of the day can make their own choices, but I think they should be very alert to peer pressure or perceived pressure because they've been, say, raising money for charity, or, they've told all their friends they're going to do this big challenge, whereas maybe in the heart of their hearts, they're thinking, I don't want to do this, I shouldn't be doing this. And that, of course, increases in anxiety, puts you in the wrong frame of mind for getting in the water or getting on the water. You're almost looking for reassurance from somebody else, which, might not be the best solution. And again, taking it maybe into the business world, many of our clients are in the offshore industries. We could give an example of something like a planned helicopter transfer where the weather is marginal. People are obviously keen to get off a platform, get back home to their families and things, and they might want that transfer to take place, but it might be the wrong thing to do on that day. And I think there is much more agreement between organisations now that doing the right thing for safety is sometimes better than just pressing on with the whatever the challenge is or the timings of a planned event.
And it's interesting you say we go through, the personal resilience in sport and just in general. And I was going to ask David, do you use as a coach any techniques or, mantras to push people through moments of doubt or exhaustion? You get, as Stuart mentioned, huge levels of anxiety before, you either start the race or you're in the changing rooms and, you're exceptionally nervous as to what's ahead. Is there anything you do for mental resilience in terms of the coaching aspect?
We would try to get the swimmers, certainly, because we do have a problem with this. We have a number of swimmers who actually they either feel or are physically sick before big competitions. And we would try to get them to think about only worrying about what is within their control. So if it's not within your control, there's no point worrying about it. Okay, you might have to think about it from a resilience perspective of dealing with the impact of whatever that is that's outside your control. But from a racing perspective, and certainly in an indoor swimming pool perspective, then you're very much, you on your own race to swim against other people. But one of the key techniques that we ask them to get to think about is to concentrate on the positives, and the positives of then thinking about what does my perfect race look like. And this was something I took from Sir Chris Hoy, who talked about it when he was doing his cycling. And it translates nicely, though, into the swimming pool. And that is, before you're in the race, when you're standing behind the blocks, you're waiting for the whistles to go, and you're in that probably the most stressful time of preparing for a race. The best thing you can do is get into a positive mindset by thinking about what my perfect race will look like. This is what my excellent dive will be like. My entry to the water is going to be really nice and clean. My stroke is going to be really nice. My turn is going to be hard and fast on my underwater, etc., etc. And you go through the whole race, but then you finalize it with that. Imagine that feeling of how good it's going to be when you finish the race. You've done the race, you've performed well, and you get that feeling of elation. And that all then helps to push aside the negatives, concentrating on the positives. And I think that's something that people can use when they're in the middle of a race. If they're really, really tough, break it down into manageable chunks. I'm going to swim to the next buoy. I'm going to kayak to the next headland. Whatever it is, small manageable chunks. How good is it going to feel when I get there? And not think about the negatives. It's difficult, really, really hard. But if they can try and keep control on that and control their breathing as much as possible, breath control has a massive, massive impact on your general resilience.
Genuinely, really interesting. And I think it also highlights the crossover between sport and life resilience as well. I know that resilience in sport often translates into everyday life, and that's whether professional or personal. But have there been moments and lessons from the training that you've given that have helped individuals overcome personal challenges? So the mantra that you're saying, small little steps, chunks, and then seeing the elation at the end of potentially a project or, a business proposal or something like that. Have you experienced someone come to you saying that these mantras have really helped me out in my personal life?
I think it happens all the time, and it will happen far more than we actually realize. So certainly I know that my daughter, who's now 17, she's been swimming. Well, I remember getting her in the water when she was only months old, and she's been in and swimming ever since. And her ability to time manage, to do that personal resilience where, she does 6 hours swimming on a typical morning in a week. So she swims 3 times a week for 2 hours a week, and she does 1.5 hours in a morning of strength and conditioning. And then in the evening, she does another 4 hours swimming and another 1 hour strength and conditioning, and potentially races at the weekend. And in that, she has to fit in all her schoolwork. And I see her now and doing all her management and her thinking, I don't have time for this. I have to plan ahead. And the way she pushes forward and the way she approaches her exams and what she perceives as a sacrifice, or some people might perceive as a sacrifice. She perceives it as a privilege. It's a privilege to be racing at this level. It's a privilege to be given the opportunity to do this. And she views it all in very positive steps. So when it comes to the exams, it's a case of it's almost a privilege to be doing these exams because I'm furthering my own career. And at the moment, I don't see many swimmers at the high level who aren't doing well in their schoolwork, because even though it's a massive challenge, they've risen to the challenge and they've managed to work it all together. So yeah, I think it sets them up perfectly for life. Equipment preparation. One of the things they tell us at the training camps is, as a parent, you don't carry the kit bags, you don't prepare the kits for them, you let them get on with it. Even at a very young age, if they get to an event and they haven't got the right equipment, it's their fault. And it trains them to do it, and it really does work.
And again, David, it takes it straight back to how we advise people in our day jobs, and thinking of an incident management team. And quite often there's a tendency to look to do one big exercise every year, when actually in reality maybe doing lots of little exercises, and maybe once a month for only some of the team. Just keeping that familiarity and ownership of their role will mean that people are much more comfortable. Heaven forbid they need to activate as an incident management team for real, because it's something that they're doing on a regular basis, and just keeping on top of those skills.
And I think that the performance at the end of the day, whether that's in sport, whether that's in the company, unless you can perform on the day when it matters, so when you are dealing with an incident, or when you are in an event, in a race, competing to try to get a time for the Commonwealth Games, the Olympic Games, whatever regional level you're at, and then unless you can perform at the time, then it doesn't really matter. So the more you practice and you get used to it, then the better the chance of you being able to perform properly on the day when it matters.
I think it's interesting that we've mentioned about the business aspect and working together as an incident management team, and obviously David coaches teams. It's interesting that sport builds so much community, and I think that's absolutely a vital point with mental resilience as well. I mean, Stuart, I know you said about the adverse effects of social media with regards to comparison, but I also think that social media and virtual run clubs, and do you think kind of the accessibility of a sporting community is better now than it's ever been?
I think in many ways, yes. I mean, there's a whole separate discussion to be had about ability for young people to access sports, particularly through schools and education, but that's maybe for a different day. But something that just popped into my head was the Scottish coastal rowing clubs that have sprung up all around Scotland, very much community based. And the idea of those clubs, if people haven't come across them, are that you build your own boat. It's based on a classic Scottish fishing boat with 4 rowers and 1 cox. But the club builds the boat and then is able to use the boats, and they will compete against their local clubs in local regattas and potentially national regattas. And a shout out to the World Championships that are taking place in Stranraer later this year, to bring people together from all over the world to do exactly the same sport. But that's sense of community. It's not just about racing, because they'll do social rows, and there are generally a group of people that will maintain the boat who might not be as physically able as they were to row it, but they're happy to, get their paintbrush out and contribute in that way. And then, of course, there's normally somebody that's willing to bake some cakes or make some sausage rolls and keep everyone fed. And so it does really bring together a little community, which otherwise might not have anything to do with the water that they live next to. So it's a really positive experience.
I can completely agree. And I think that regardless of what sport you're doing, because it gives you commonality of purpose if you're part of a team, it gives you mutual understanding. You know what everybody else is going through, and you can then talk about it and you can support each other. So very much like you would do in an incident management team or in an organizational environment, the more you know about what those other people are going through, the easier it is for you to be able to support each other and then work together as a team. People think of swimming as very much an individual sport, and a lot of it is. When you're actually in the water, largely you're swimming up against yourself. But then again, when you're part of a team and you see the way that people are just cheering each other on, they're really getting behind them. They're running a spare pair of goggles down to them because the first pair is broken, and the whole team comes together. And the bigger the environment you go into, then, and the bigger the geographical area, then the bigger the team gets. And it's fantastic to see. Really, really good.
Yeah, and I was just kind of going on to the team ethos and the atmosphere. Have you ever seen it, David, where, you have the team together and it's almost the anxiety spreads, or you have a positive atmosphere that spreads? How do you ensure that, before a race, people are thinking positively and they actually get enjoyment out of the sport, which is something that we haven't really spoken about, is enjoying the sport that you're competing in?
Fun and enjoyment are absolutely key to what we're doing. So, and if they don't enjoy it, they're not going to train hard. They're not going to perform well. So again, that team spirit, trying to keep a lighter atmosphere going, trying to keep people talking so they're not sitting on their own individually in the stands waiting for a race. Some people like to be lost in their own little world with their AirPods in before they go immediately for a race. Others, it's quite nice, and certainly for kids, to be there as a group, having a chat, having a laugh, having a bit of fun, and then right, come on then, I've got to go do my race now. Great, go on then, off you go. Everybody wishes everybody good luck, pats on the back, and then the big congratulations afterwards. They all love it. And relays are the thing that really get everybody going, because that really is part of the team. Nobody wants to let the relay team down. And the smiles and the face paints and everything else that comes out, they're obviously having an absolute ball. So yeah, it's really, 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 really useful, the teamwork. Essential, in fact, and enjoyment.
You see that from, the way that every 4 years as the Olympic comes around and the whole country gets behind, the team, and everybody is enjoying watching the spectators and watching, the appreciating the fact that it's not just the team that are poolside or pitch side at the time, it's all those supporters, right back to the person that taught them how to sail when they were 8, or the person that first put them in a kayak when they were 8, or in the pool. Yeah, appreciating the wider team is certainly something that, again, applies to the business world as well, because it's not just the incident management team, it's the whole organisation that has to respond to any kind of disruption in a resilient setting.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that disruption, certainly from a sporting perspective, can also come from injury. If we do actually move on and you do find out that you're working hard, you're training hard, clearly you're putting a lot of stress and strain on your body, especially when you're younger and your body's developing, and there are injuries in there. And the time I see some of the greatest resilience is when people come back, and they come back from their injuries and they get back in the water again. I've got swimmers with knee problems, with shoulder problems, and some of them who haven't competed properly for 18 months. And they find it really, really tough when they're watching their friends going off and competing, and they're knocking times down, they're getting the personal bests down, they're potentially getting medals at events and progressing up the ladder, and they're then stuck. So the first time that they get back in the water again, when they think they're good and they think they're fixed, we have to try to really encourage them just to say that take it steadily. You've got to think about those small goals, right? I'm just going to do a small amount first. Be ready for mental setbacks. Be ready to take it back to the start again. Just get ready or be realistic about your goals and what you'd like to achieve in the right time frame, and talk to people, because other people know what you're going through. So we would suggest them to talk to the coach, talk to the physio, talk to their fellow swimmers. People will understand rather than bottling it all up. But yeah, bouncing back from an injury can be really, really hard and takes a lot of mental resilience.
I think that's a really good point. And the advice you suggest to give someone struggling kind of with the aspect of returning to the sport after injury is really good. And just highlighting again the fact that recovering from injury is not just a physical process, but it's an extremely mental kind of resilience process and requires an insane amount of patience. So I think that's really good advice you'd give to someone recovering from an injury as well.
I think people try to push through pain and when they're recovering back from injuries, and it takes a lot of mental strength when you're determined to achieve, to be able to say, I'm going to push through this pain barrier. But actually, no, that's definitely not the right thing, because you'll set your recovery back by months, if not years. And in extreme conditions, you may never participate and compete again.
No, that's all really, really good points. And I just want to thank you, David and Stuart, for a really interesting discussion. I know we've focused it around kind of the water-based activities, And it is quite relatable to the running podcast that we did in our last episode. I think it's all relatable. It's really good points. And I thank you to our listeners as well. And hopefully you'll join us on our next podcast. So thank you very much to everyone.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.